Hello, I'm Joel Woodruff, president of the C.S. Lewis Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this Institute event titled, Is Jesus the Only Way? With Amy Orr-Ewing. For those not familiar with the C.S. Lewis Institute, CSLI was founded 48 years ago as a servant ministry to the church for the purpose of helping develop disciples of Jesus Christ who will articulate, defend, share, and live their faith in personal and public life. Our Heart and Mind Discipleship Ministry now has 17 locations in the United States, Canada, and Northern Ireland, and people around the world download and use the small group resources, articles, audio and video materials, and podcasts available through our award-winning website. Thousands of men and women have also participated in our year-long, tuition-free C.S. Lewis Fellows program. The program equips people to be competent and confident in their faith in Jesus Christ, so that they can become multipliers for the faith, making disciples through their work, church, and family life. To see if there's a Fellows program in your city, go to our website and click on Fellows Program and Locations. There's also a link in the chat room of this broadcast. The application for the Fellows program is now open, so don't wait and check it out today. For more information on any other CSLI programs, I encourage you to go to our website and subscribe to receive our free digital discipleship resources and announcements about upcoming events like this one. You can do that by scrolling down to the bottom of our homepage and clicking subscribe. Now please join me in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the opportunity to consider this question, is Jesus the only way? With Dr. Amy Orr-Ewing. We pray that you would use her message and her thoughts to help us all to discover more clearly how powerful and wonderful you are, and also be able to understand the good, wonderful hope and message we have in Jesus Christ. Pray this in your name. Amen. It's now my pleasure to share about today's speaker, Dr. Amy Orr-Ewing, who recorded the following presentation in our CSLI studios on a recent trip to the United States. Amy is an international author, speaker, and Christian apologist who addresses the deep questions of our day with meaningful answers found in the Christian faith. She's the author of multiple books, including Where is God in All the Suffering and the best-selling Why Trust the Bible. And she has a recent publication titled Mary's Voice, Advent Reflections to Contemplate the Coming of Christ. Over the last 20 years, Amy has given talks and answered hundreds of questions on university campuses around the world. She's also addressed members of the British Parliament and staffers on Capitol Hill and the West Wing of the White House. Amy's interested in the intersection of questions of meaning and faith within the marketplace, education, leadership, and policy making. She holds a doctorate in theology from the University of Oxford and serves as an honorary lecturer in divinity at the University of Aberdeen. Amy's also been a friend of the C.S. Lewis Institute for many years. In today's broadcast, Amy will be addressing one of the most important questions anyone can ask. Is Jesus the only way? In other words, is the gospel of Jesus Christ the only way they enter into a relationship with the Creator of the world, find forgiveness of sins, and receive the gift of eternal life? In today's pluralistic world in which the idea that truth is relative and that there can be many ways to God, the proclamation of Jesus in John 14:6 can be seen as a radical one. Because there Jesus states this. He says, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Let's listen in now as Amy unpacks this important topic.
Well, hello and welcome to the C.S. Lewis Institute, and today we're considering the question, is Jesus the only way? We're tackling a very difficult question today. It's a question about truth and eternity and accountability, and it's a question that can make us feel a little bit uncomfortable. The story is told of a little boy who went to his parents asking, where do people come from? And he first approached his father. He said, Dad, how do people come to be born? And his father said, well, there was Adam and there was Eve and they had babies and then their babies had babies and that's how people came to be born. boy wasn't totally convinced, so he went to his mother and he said, "Mum, how did people come to be born?" And she said, "Well, over millions and millions of years, apes evolved into becoming human beings, and then their babies had babies, and that's how people came to be." The boy went back to his dad and said, "Dad, you lied to me. This is what Mum said." And his father said to him, "No, darling, your mother was talking about her side of the family." Sometimes questions of truth can be uncomfortable. And when we talk about Jesus as the way to know God, or the only way to know God, we're actually reflecting on his claims to be God with us in human form. Let's take a step back. What do you think of when you look at Jesus, when you imagine Jesus? Is it a man in sandals with golden flowing locks and a white robe? Is it a two-dimensional figure in a stained glass window? Is Jesus a good moral teacher or a Che Guevara-style left-wing revolutionary? Is Jesus a spiritual guru or perhaps even a swear word? Is Jesus a distant figure of a bygone era of grandparents or parents that we might have thought about occasionally, but not very relevant to us? The beginning of John's Gospel claims that Jesus Christ is God with us. In the famous song, Joan Osborne asked the question, what if God was one of us, just a slob like one of us, just a stranger on a bus trying to make his way home? In contrast, John writes, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made, and without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. The Word of God. John's Gospel introduces us to the concept of God, the Word. That first sentence is simple to read, but it is so profound that the greatest minds have had to grapple with it over centuries and have found levels of meaning. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. If the Word was God, how can God be with God? John introduces the nature of God as a fellowship, and that's immensely important. God is a trinity of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. God is a fellowship in himself. God experiences relationship in his very being. God is the Word who is at the beginning, and this word in Greek is the word logos, from which we derive the idea of logic. The word logos already had a meaning in the Greco-Roman world. Stoics used it as the rational principle behind the universe. Thought, reason, even science itself derived from that idea of logos. But it was also used to describe the expression of speech. Logos was a word spoken. But here John takes this word logos, which people already understood to a certain extent, and he applies it to Jesus. And he says, Jesus is God the logos, God the Word. He is the one who has always existed with his Father, and he is the source of creation and information. Now, before the Big Bang Theory, scientists used to believe that the universe was eternal. And opponents of the Big Bang Theory opposed it because its propagation seemed to be leading people to start to believe in the Bible, that the universe had a beginning, that the universe was made. Earlier on, when we heard the passage read that the Logos became flesh and dwelt among us, that idea means that the eternal God, the creator of the world who brought this universe into existence that wasn't always eternal, that had a beginning, and the one behind it, Jesus, the Son of God, the uncaused first cause of the universe, the Logos from whom all the information in the world, all the DNA comes, he, that Logos, takes flesh and dwells among us. Jesus is God incarnate, God come down to us. He's the one coming in space and time and history. In Jesus, God doesn't just observe this world with its sickness and suffering. He doesn't just remain far off. He doesn't even just send a book of rules so that we could, by sheer determination, improve ourselves. He doesn't give people strange hallucinations that they need to interpret in some way. He himself comes taking human flesh, and he lives on this earth so that people can know him and know God. It's not really surprising then that in John's Gospel, 15 times in reference to Jesus, he asks people to look, behold, see. He's saying this is utterly amazing. No attempt for humanity to find God, to kind of clamber our way towards God, could approximate this. The infinite glory of the Creator coming into our world as a man, as a human being. Will you look? Will you see? Now, John claims we have seen him and known. We've seen his glory, the glory of the only one, the one and only. And he writes his gospel so that other people like you and I, can see him and know him. So that's the central claim about Jesus as the way to God. But isn't this talk about Jesus and God just a matter of faith? A kind of separate kind of category of things from knowledge or from reality or truth? Faith, according to Richard Dawkins, is a belief in something despite evidence to the contrary. In other words, if there were evidence, you wouldn't need faith to believe it. But biblical faith means to trust in something or someone who is actually there. Biblical faith is a belief based on evidence. I have faith in my husband and in his love. I can't empirically quantify that love, but I have good evidence for it, and so I have faith in him. Now, this idea sometimes is, in our world, expressed that there are different kinds of people. There are people who have faith and people who don't have faith. Faith communities are a nonsense in some way, because actually everyone has faith or a worldview, and that includes atheists and secularists who exercise as much faith in their belief system as the next person. So as we consider this question together, is Jesus the only way to God? I want to zero in on two particular challenges to Christ's claim to be the way to God. These two challenges we're going to look at are firstly the challenge of materialism and secondly the challenge of religious relativism. So firstly, let's think about materialism. This challenge to the idea of Jesus as the only way to God. Materialism or skepticism is based on the ideas of the philosopher David Hume, who lived in the 1700s between 1711 and 1776 in Scotland. And Hume argued that all objects of human inquiry are either relations of ideas, that means mathematical statements and definitions, or they're matters of fact, that means everything which can be known and tested empirically. And Hume wrote these words. He said, "When we run over libraries persuaded of these principles, what havoc must we make? If we take in our hand any volume of divinity or school metaphysics, for example, let us ask, does it contain abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? No. Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact and existence? No. Commit it then to the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion." Do you see what he's saying here? He's saying things are either testable empirically in a sort of scientific, repeatable experiment, or they're matters of fact, they're testable analytically. And if your idea, your truth, your faith doesn't fit into one of those categories, commit it to the flames. It's worthless. However, there are serious problems with this. And the main problem is that Hume's philosophy fails its own test. because his own statement fits into neither of his categories. It was the apologist Norman Geisler who commented, "The statement that only analytical or empirical propositions are meaningful is not itself an analytic, true by definition, or empirical statement, and hence, by its own criteria, it is meaningless." C.S. Lewis deals with this kind of materialist approach in his usual lucid manner, showing that a dogmatic commitment to this philosophy makes thinking itself problematic. He wrote this, he said, "It follows that no account of the universe can be true unless that account leaves it possible for our thinking to be a real insight. A theory which explained everything else in the whole universe, but which made it impossible to believe that our thinking was valid, would be utterly out of court, for that theory would itself have been reached by thinking. Thus, a strict materialism refutes itself for the reasons given long ago by Professor Haldane. If my mental processes are determined wholly by the motions of atoms in my brain, I have no reason to suppose that my beliefs are true, and hence I have no reason for supposing my brain to be composed of atoms." A kind of passionate commitment to a purely material world and the non-possibility of miraculous interventions from outside is problematic. For the materialist, thinking itself becomes a process which would fall outside the remit of that which had the capacity for meaning. Without empirical proof, this claim of Jesus to be the only way to God could still be true. It would need to be explored, but it could still be true. Materialism cannot count out the possibility that Jesus is the way to God. And I want to suggest that it would actually still need to be explored. It would need to be explored on the basis of evidence, philosophical, moral, historical, cosmological, evidences for God and Jesus. So the challenge of materialism can't do away with Jesus' claim to be the only way to God. The second challenge I want us to spend a bit longer on is the challenge of religious relativism. And this is the idea that all religions are basically the same. Therefore, how could we say that Jesus Christ is the way to God or the only way to God? That would be a terrible thing to say, according to a religious relativist. Now, many theologians have pointed out that oftentimes people like to believe that all the religions are fundamentally the same, but just superficially different. Whereas in fact, they're actually just superficially similar, but fundamentally different. The poet Steve Turner puts it like this in his satirical poem: "We believe there's something in horoscopes, UFOs, and bent spoons. Jesus was a good man just like Buddha, Muhammad, and ourselves. We believe he was a good teacher of morals, but we believe that his good morals are really bad. We believe that all religions are basically the same. At least the one we read was, they all believe in love and goodness. They only differ on matters of creation, sin, heaven, hell, God, and salvation." So just a few little disagreements there. But if the religious and non-religious worldviews or faiths are not the same and are not compatible, i.e., they're contradictory, they can't all be valid. It cannot be the case that there is no God and the universe is a random product of chance, and at the same time it be the case that there is a rational personal God who brought the universe into existence by design. It cannot be the case that there is no personal God, only ultimate reality, a kind of impersonal Brahman with nirvana as the aim of existence, and be the case that there is a personal God who has made real people who are capable of thought and relationship. Religious relativism has a challenge to face. These massive contradictions between all the ideas tell us that the religions are not all the same. Or we could take the question of suffering, perhaps the most important question facing us as human beings today. Different faith perspectives have wildly different answers to this question. At the funeral of the child of some dear friends, the service began with the thought that this precious baby boy who was being buried had never known a day without love. The pain and grief of those who loved him most was the cost of that love. He was loved. For me, love is the starting place for untangling questions of pain and suffering, and especially the question, where is God in suffering? Love seems to be at the absolute core of why suffering feels like it does. Suffering feels so wrong to us because of our love for another person who's in distress. And we instinctively rage against injustice because we feel that people deserve love and dignity. And when I suffer, the question I'm struggling with at the deepest level is this: am I loved? And if I'm truly loved, how could all this be happening to me? But when we ask those kinds of questions, we're making an assumption that people have inherent and sacred value by virtue of being human, that I have value because I am human. But can we take for granted that love is a foundational concept from which to ask questions about suffering and God? As we might try and wrap our minds around this very important question, is it true that love is the most important question? Aren't there other ways of looking at this question that are not grounded in a relational perspective and all that follows from the prospect of the existence of a loving God? Could we meaningfully say that suffering is wrong rather than simply unlucky? Well, when we look at other faith perspectives, you'll see how different they are with regard to this question. You may be aware that Eastern philosophy views human suffering through the dual lenses of karma and reincarnation. When something painful happens, karma tells me there's a moral law of cause and effect that's a cosmic law, and it guides the circumstances of our lives. So if I get a disease or I have an accident, the law of karma tells me I'm getting what I deserve. The fact that the thing I've done that makes me deserve that pain may not be immediately obvious to me is complicated by the idea of reincarnation. In this view, the universe recycles over multiple lifetimes, and so it is believed we may be experiencing the effects of karma for something done in a previous life. I had a neighbour for a couple of years in Oxford who believed that she had been a member of the French resistance during the Second World War. And she felt that her failure to pass on a particular message in time during that war was the cause of her back pain in this life. Karma was running its course. She was getting what she deserved. Suffering is inflicted in this way of looking at the world by a faceless system of law, leaving us with what it determines we deserve. Buddhism encourages its followers to seek detachment as a way of processing suffering. The Buddha left his wife and home on the night that his first child was born. He left his palace in order to seek enlightenment, and that meant moving away from emotional bonds to become detached from them and this world. Buddhist enlightenment is essentially following the Buddha's example in choosing disconnection from everything. Human suffering, he taught, comes from desire. Desiring something or someone is the root of suffering. And so the Buddhist answer is to expunge all desire for anything or anyone, to cease wanting things and reach a state of enlightenment, which is a kind of nothingness. Is pain the cost of love? This way of looking at the world would answer yes. And so to avoid pain, the answer offered is to get rid of all attachment, even love. If Eastern thought teaches karma and Buddhist thought teaches that there's no God, there's just ultimate reality, and there's just the possibility of detachment as our route to be saved from suffering, another view is the idea within Islam, giving us a different perspective, a monotheistic view of the world, that there is one God, but a fatalistic religion teaching that a transcendent God is absolutely and directly in control of every aspect of the universe. And as a consequence, human beings do not have real choice. There's only one will in the universe, and that is Allah's will. That is why that word inshallah, meaning if God wills it, is so significant for Muslims. A few years ago, a friend described to me his experience of training a group of Iraqi soldiers for service in their own armed forces. This particular gentleman had taken a group of Iraqi recruits, and they were doing a survival exercise in a swimming pool. The idea was that 2 recruits would be pushed with their pack and all their clothes and boots and everything on into the pool, and they would struggle to the surface in order to survive. So the initial 2 recruits were pushed into the deep end of the swimming pool, and one struggled to the surface, the other dropped like a stone to the bottom. The instructor described their panic as they worried for this man's safety, and someone dived in, got the pack off, released some of the weight from this individual, pulled him up to the surface, got him out of the pool, gave him a pat on the back to get the water up his chest, and he was spluttering, he was alive, and they shouted at him, "Why didn't you swim?" And he shrugged. He said, "If it be his will that I die, I would have died. Clearly, it was God's will that I lived. Inshallah. I embrace my fate because it is the will of God." This illustrates the extent to which a mindset of God's will being all that matters influences our way of seeing the world and acting in it. Since logically both good and evil exist, they must both be God's will. And so when we're in pain, we conclude that everything that is happening to us is directly God's will. God is the author of it all, and so we may as well just accept it. Love doesn't really come into it, and neither does asking why. Is it meaningless? A different, I would argue, religious or faith-based worldview is what we might call naturalism, materialism. Naturalism is that system derived from the belief that everything in life has a purely natural physical explanation. So when we're thinking about suffering, naturalism would say suffering doesn't really matter. God doesn't exist. There's no spiritual or religious dimension to life. There's no God who created the natural world. Human beings are our own highest authority. We're well able to determine our own destiny and our own morality. And within this way of looking at the world, any experience of pain is essentially random. It's just a consequence of living in the physical world and nothing more. And since the physical biochemical world is all that exists, any sense of connection to another person and love for them is viewed primarily physiologically through my body, through the atoms of my existence. The pain I may experience as the result of a loss of someone I'm connected to doesn't have any deeper metaphysical or spiritual dimension. Suffering, like everything else, is merely physical, material, and natural. And when it comes to suffering that might have a more directly moral dimension, this is particularly significant. For example, if a woman is sexually assaulted, naturalism has not rooted morality objectively in God. Sexual assault is wrong in absolute terms, regardless of what the law of the land where it occurred says, and God is the ultimate judge of this. Instead, it has rooted morality subjectively, either in personal preference, I don't want this to happen to me or those I love, therefore it's wrong, or in societal taboo. As a society, we see this as damaging, and so we need to create laws to make sure it doesn't happen. As the author and champion of atheistic naturalism, Richard Dawkins, said in a radio interview, we as human beings supply our own basis for ethics. Perhaps a deeper and more personal question for advocates of naturalism to consider in all of this is our anguish as human beings in response to pain. Human life isn't essentially sacred, but is merely an accident of chance and biology and chemistry. Does our outrage and anguish in the face of suffering really make sense? Why would human beings have any intrinsic worth and such a deep conscious and emotive response to pain and suffering without God existing? The atheist professor Peter Singer argues that in the absence of God, human beings have no more value or moral intuition than any other animal. Does human life have value? Does it really matter if thousands die in a global pandemic without access to a ventilator and alone in order to protect loved ones from catching the virus? Can we hear of the deaths of young people in a classroom on the other side of the world, gunned down by an unstable classmate, and simply shrug our shoulders? When we watch a documentary about wildlife in Africa and observe a lioness catching a warthog, do we have similar reactions to when we watch a documentary about a serial killer murdering women? I think that human life does have essential value, and that our reaction to the sufferings of human beings, even those we don't know, points towards this. And so we're left with the question, if it's the case that there is no God who gives human life value and meaning and significance beyond our physical existence, why do we care so much about massacres and hunger and injustice or the sufferings of other humans? Why does this darkness hurt so much? Why does suffering really matter? Where do we get our essential worth and dignity from? Our outrage in reaction to suffering, including the suffering of people we don't know, and our human experience of pain itself, all confirm the common human intuition that there is more to life than some might say. So let me offer a Christian perspective. A Christian perspective sets forth the idea that God exists and that Jesus is the way to God, that God is a personal being, that God is essentially loving, and that God has made human beings in his image with a capacity to reason, to choose, and to love. And it could follow from this that when we suffer, it hurts us as human beings in such a profound and shocking way, because human beings really do matter, because we are divine image bearers, and so our lives and well-being are sacred. That would mean that pain and suffering would hurt us at more than a physical level, and that if God is real and God is loving, pain would be the cost of love. Real love is simply not possible without freedom of choice. Compelled love is never love. And so the possibility of love entails the possibility of pain. And the Bible talks of a good God creating a good world and specifically making creatures who have the capacity to love. For love to exist, freedom must exist. I remember as a teenager growing up in a city in the UK called Birmingham, and I became friends with a girl whose parents were trying to force her into a marriage with someone she didn't know. She was 15 and she was afraid, and she had good reason to be afraid because a relative of hers had been in the same position a year earlier. She tried to run away, but she had been knocked down by a car in the street and dragged home and forcibly taken out of the country to marry. No one had seen her or heard from her again. My friend at 15 knew she didn't want that. She wanted to love and be loved. She felt that being forced into a legal partnership by her parents with someone she did not know was the antithesis of love. She believed the love she was capable of giving and receiving could not be compelled by another. So friends helped her to get to a safe house. For true love to be possible, it must be freely offered and received. We all know this to be the case. And the Bible tells us that God, who is love, made a world in which love is possible. And that means a world in which there's freedom. And we as human beings have used that freedom to harm as well as to love. And that is why there is suffering in this world. Genesis describes the impact of choices human beings have made on ourselves, on other people, and on the very environment of the earth. The Bible doesn't just address why bad things happen, though. There's a deeper kind of answer in Jesus, and this relates to why Jesus is the only way. Because at the cross, Jesus suffers with us and for us as human beings. The unique claim of Christ to deal with our human condition, not to write it off as karma, not to tell us to just detach ourselves from suffering, not to just embrace fatalism and say, well, it's all planned in advance and it all must be God's will and we just fatally wait here to see what happens. Not to embrace materialism, which reduces us to just the physics and biochemistry of our bodies. In Jesus Christ, sacredness of our humanity, our image bearer status as human beings, is affirmed and is redeemed. There's no other worldview that offers anything like this. And I want to suggest that if it is true, it would be exclusively true. It couldn't be true at the same time that the law of karma is at work. And it couldn't be true at the same time that there's a sort of fatalism and that God is actually responsible for all the harm in this world. And it couldn't be true at the same time that the answer is actually nirvana and we need to seek detachment and turn our back on the idea of love. Is Jesus the only way to God? If his claim is true, if the evidence about him is trustworthy, I think the answer is yes. There's another issue, isn't there, with the idea of religious relativism, the second challenge that we're looking at. The idea of there being other faiths which are all either exactly the same or equally valid. And I want to ask the question, why can't the Christian faith make a claim to public truth and compete in the marketplace of other ideas, philosophical, moral, scientific worldviews? Now, relativism, in a sense, is the objection to Christianity as the truth. And it's sometimes phrased as a sort of common generalisation. All truth is relative. Except that statement itself, of course. As Professor Roger Scruton famously put it, he said, if someone tells you there's no such thing as truth, they're asking you not to believe them, so don't. Another way of articulating religious relativism is with the idea of tolerance. It would be intolerant to say that Jesus is the only way to God. Tolerance of other people's views is a highly prized virtue in our culture. But when talking about religion, it has come to mean accepting that all religions are equally true or untrue. No distinctions can be made. Now, I want to think about this together for a moment because we could ask the question, what does tolerance actually mean? A helpful dictionary definition is this. Tolerance is the willingness to accept or tolerate somebody or something, especially opinions or behaviours that you may not agree with, or people who are not like you. The important fact here to remember is that tolerance is needed for people who have different opinions. So if I agree with you that your path leads to God as much as mine, I don't need to be tolerant because we agree. It is only if I disagree that I need to be tolerant towards another person's view. If Jesus is the only way to God, and I believe that, then I would need to exercise tolerance towards people who disagree with that. And I would want to ask that those people also exercise tolerance to me. A further objection to the idea that Jesus is the only way to God on the basis of religious relevance is the idea of arrogance. It's the sense that it would be arrogant to say that Jesus is the only way to God. And this point is often made using the ancient Indian parable or story of an elephant in the jungle. This famous story envisages an elephant standing in the jungle, and there are different blind scribes that come up to the elephant, and these different blind scribes hold on to a different part of the elephant. One is holding the tail and he says, this is a rope. Another is holding the trunk and he says, no, that's not a rope, it's a snake. Another is holding the leg of the elephant and he says, you two are both wrong. It's not a rope, it's not a snake, it's a tree trunk. Another is holding the ear of the elephant and making a different point. And the moral of the story is that the different individuals, the different scribes holding a different part of the elephant represent the different religions of the world. The moral of the story is that no one faith has the whole truth, and it would be arrogant for one of those people to say, I've got the truth and you're all wrong. Everybody has a little piece of it. Now, the intriguing thing about this parable is that there are two important differences between the person telling the story and the people inside the story. The first is a difference in perspective. The people inside the story are close to the elephant, but the storyteller is standing back and has the whole picture. The second difference is more fundamental. The people inside the story are blind, and the person telling the story can see. The clear implication of this story is that Jesus, Buddha, Krishna, Muhammad, and Moses were blind, but the storyteller can see. Who sounds arrogant now? It's actually just as arrogant to claim that you know that all paths lead to God as it is to claim that you agree with Jesus, that he is the only way to God. The issue on which you reject the Christian faith should not be arrogance, since surely it is just as arrogant to say that all paths lead to God, or that none at all lead there, or that one leads there. The question is not whether it's arrogant to say that Jesus is the way to God, but is it true? Is it real? Now, a further challenge, other than being arrogant, as we consider whether we can say Jesus is the only way to God, and other than being arrogant or being intolerant in some way, is the implication that Christianity is excluding and not including. Now, that word inclusive is a very powerful word in our cultural moment. And people have a sense that it would always be wrong to exclude, and it would always be right to be inclusive. Isn't it wrong to say that somebody else is wrong? Now, of course, the ironic thing about this is that the person who is saying that it's wrong to say someone else is wrong is saying that you are wrong for saying what you believe. No matter how hard you try to escape, you can't avoid the fact that one truth claim will always exclude some possibilities. So wherever we put ourselves with regard to religious relativism, we are going to be exclusive in some sense. The person who says that all ways lead to God excludes the view that only one way leads to God or only some ways lead to God. The person who says that only some ways lead to God excludes the possibility that only one way leads to God or that all ways lead to God. And so the person who says that only one way to God is true also excludes the some view and the all view. In other words, all perspectives exclude. So it seems a little unreasonable to single out the Christian faith and reject it on the basis that it excludes. Let's return to that beginning of John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. And the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. The central heart of the Christian faith is that Jesus is God coming into this world to make a way for us to be with him. That possibility does exclude the idea that everything is just karma. It does exclude the idea of fatalism, that everything is down to God. We don't have a free will. We don't have an exercise of choice possible. It does exclude the possibility that there's no God at all behind this universe. There's no logos. And that Jesus obviously can't be God since God doesn't exist. If it is true that Jesus was God taking on human flesh to come and dwell among us, that would be a way made by God for us to know him. That is unlike any of the alternatives that are out there. So is Jesus the only way to God? I think a good case can be made that the answer to that question is yes. I think we can examine and explore materialist objections and religious relativist objections, and we can come to the conclusion that Jesus is the only way to God. We're going to move on to some questions now that have come in. And the first question is, don't people just tend to accept the viewpoint they were raised in? I think this is a really good question, because as it relates to whether Jesus is being the only way to God, it's kind of the idea that it's a bit unfair that some people are sort of born into the truth and other people are not born into the truth. And it seems very, very arbitrary. And that seems to be evidence that it couldn't be actually the truth. But what I would want to suggest today with regard to that question is that the Christian faith envisages itself not as a cultural movement spread through people having children and passing their faith on to people within their own culture. The Christian faith has always been a missionary movement. And at the heart of the Christian faith is the idea of seeking to persuade people that this is true. The central historical claim of the Christian faith is that Jesus was God incarnate with us. The Word became flesh, that he died by crucifixion at the hands of the Romans, but that 3 days later his tomb was found empty. And that's why Christians preach about the resurrection of Jesus all the time and share the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Because the idea is that there's been a public miracle in history, which is there for people to scrutinise and consider and come to a conclusion about that personally on the basis of evidence. And so while it may be true that oftentimes people do just accept the viewpoint of their parents, the Christian faith makes a claim to be publicly true, historically true, universally true, regardless of the culture into which we were born. Okay, the second question that's come in is, how could I know which faith is the true one? I think this is a really great question. It's an honest question, because it feels like a pretty daunting task to check all the evidence for all the options, doesn't it? You know, we might say that we would need to spend a long time exploring Buddhism before we agreed with it or disagreed with it, or Islam or Hinduism or actually atheistic materialism. And surely, you know, one lifetime wouldn't be enough to actually explore all the possibilities and come to a conclusion about what is actually true. I like to sort of think about this with an analogy that philosophers sometimes use. And imagine that we're talking about the universe and we're asking the question, do spotted green stones exist? Now, what would I need to do in order to disprove that spotted green stones exist in the universe? I'd need to make an exhaustive study of the universe in order to be certain. I'd need to know every nook and cranny, every corner of the universe to know that there's no such thing as a spotted green stone. But what would I need to do in order to say a spotted green stone exists? I would need to find it. I'd need to find one. So I would encourage you, if this is your question, to begin by examining the evidence. And I would want to encourage you to begin by examining the evidence for the Christian faith. Philosophical, historical, moral, scientific, personal evidence that the Christian faith is true. And once you discover and find what is true on the basis of evidence, you can then draw legitimate conclusions on the basis of that sort of evidence. Third question, what would you say to the idea that God is just wish fulfillment and we're better off not deluding ourselves? Well, this is an idea that the psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud most popularised. And he envisaged God as the ultimate wish fulfillment. So he said, you know, this idea of a father figure in the sky, weak-minded people project this idea because they just desire, they have a psychological or emotional need for a loving father figure in the sky to exist. And so they've created that idea and projected God into existence. And it was C.S. Lewis who famously countered that and said, well, couldn't we equally say to Freud that atheism is exactly the same? It's the ultimate wish fulfillment. The desire for a father figure in the sky not to exist is a projection of the human mind from the psyche of someone who doesn't want the ultimate father figure. Where does that leave us? That doesn't leave us with a conclusion as to whether God is real and Jesus is the only way to God, but it shows that the argument of wish fulfillment could cut both ways, and it suggests that we need to settle the question of whether God is real on a different basis. And I would want to suggest we settle that question of whether God is real and Jesus is the only way. We settle that on the basis of the evidence that does exist. We examine the evidence and come to a conclusion on the basis of the evidence. And it's my experience that coming to know God through Jesus has been the most wonderful relationship and journey of my life. The offer at the heart of the Christian faith is for forgiveness and redemption and relationship with the Creator of this world. Because through Jesus' sacrifice on the cross, his crucifixion, he can carry away the sins and the burden and the evil and the abuse of this world. He can carry it away from us upon himself. And he offers his life for our life. And then through the resurrection, he demonstrates that he has conquered the power of sin and death and evil. And so we can trust him, not just with our lives, but with our death, with our eternity. We can face life and eternity with confidence, knowing that we will be with him, loved by him. And that's a relationship that begins in space and time now, in our lives, and continues through into eternity. Thank you so much for joining us for this session with the C.S. Lewis Institute and the question of is Jesus the only way to God? Thank you.
I hope that you were encouraged and helped by Amy's masterful unpacking of the question, is Jesus the only way? If after hearing this message, you'd like to learn more about what it means to follow Jesus Christ and to make him Lord and Savior of your life, please reach out to us at the C.S. Lewis Institute by emailing us at staff@cslewisinstitute.org. We'll be sure to respond and share more with you about the ways in which Jesus addresses the questions of life. Thank you again to Dr. Amy Orr-Ewing for her wonderful presentation, and thanks to all of you who joined us this evening. If you enjoyed tonight's broadcast and would like to help us produce more events like this one, please prayerfully consider supporting this ministry financially. You may do so by going to the Give page on our website. May God bless you.